So I'm going to be coming from, I think, a bit of a different perspective than has been presented so far, but inevitably there's going to be some overlap because we're talking about writing the future. And I think largely what I decided to do for today's talk is speak from my own personal experience over the last, really, the 10 years, which has been essentially writing about the future. But over the last 6 months in particular, it's been a major change for me writing for IO9. So I largely want to go over some of the adjustments that I've had to make as a result of that transition, which has really been eye-opening in the sense that for the previous 10 years, I've largely been writing to this community here. And this community has been very receptive. It's been it's a very primed audience, if you will, and at the same time, it can be a very insular audience. And having to now write for really what is a major media publication with a much more, with a greater, I guess, a larger audience, but also an audience that hasn't ever been exposed to this stuff, it has been a challenge for me, and that's essentially what I'm going to be speaking about today. So how do you convey these topics, these subjects, to what is a general audience? And really what it reminded me of, this whole process, is that we are still, in a way, as futurists and as futurologists and now as journalists, having to deal with future shock. Future shock is not something that has gone away. And in fact, if anything, future shock is still something that has perhaps never been more pertinent now that we live in the age of accelerating change. So I'm, I guess, what you'd call a first-generation transhumanist blogger or futurist blogger. That's not to suggest by any extent of the imagination that I was amongst the first to talk about these themes. And there has been a rich tradition prior to the blogosphere emerging of getting these ideas out in traditional publications. So for example, as already noted today, back in the 80s, there was, in the 90s, there was Mondo 2000, which was really a precursor to Wired magazine. And then there were some other journals as well. It was also even worth noting that there was a kind of futurism that certainly was spawned from the 50s and 60s space race and the space age. So the futurism that did exist, if you will, in the public mindset tended to be more of that gee whiz type futurism, that rockets and spaceships and jetpacks and flying cars and that sort of a thing, extravagantly designed cities and transportation. So the kind of futurism that we're talking about here and the kind of futurism that has emerged is more of the, I guess, the transhumanist themed vision of future, which I'll get into some more details later. So then you're following outlets like Mondo 2000. Then you also had, and I'm now speaking about kinds of the inspirations for the initial writing that I had done. There was, of course, the extropian movement and the writings that they had done, and the listservs that they had were tremendous. They were high volume and some of the most engaging conversations I've ever been involved in my life. And then, of course, the work of the World Transhumanist Association, which is now H+, actually. And then there was, I started my blog back in 2002, and I just had my 10th anniversary. It was kind of interesting because literally the week I had my 10th anniversary, I was brought on board IO9, so it was a kind of a beautiful, I think, timing, if you will, to kind of move on to a next step of how I was going to convey some of these ideas. And so I also did have one episode of experience writing, if you will, for a webzine, and that was what Simon Smith and we had set up in the mid-portion of the 2000s, was a site called Better Humans. And it was, I think it was like the very first explicitly pro-human enhancement, pro-transhumanist webzine that was on the web. And we had some exemplary writers on there, and I'm very proud of what we did. We managed to make a run at it for a couple of years, and then we just lost all steam. But again, as my blogging experience indicated, this was always going to be, at least at that time, it was going to be a very specific niche audience that we were writing to, and we never were able to break out of the bounds of an already primed audience. So again, always having this experience of where I'm writing to, or even preaching to the choir, if you will. And again, just because people have been kind of expressing even an interest in some of the history in the movement as well. What kind of brings somebody into this community? What I have found in my experience, and again, I'm trying to differentiate the audience that I used to be writing to toward the audience that I'm writing to now, are the different gateways that bring people into some of these ideas. And in my experience, there tend to be about 3 or 4 of these so-called gateways. there's first and foremost is the radical life extension entryway. And that's almost, I think, a very significant part. Can I actually have a show of hands? Who here came into transhumanism or futurism because of life extension or radical life extension? Maybe you can even prove me wrong, but there's a fair enough. There's a fair enough. So there was that angle. I can remember, for example, when we founded the Toronto Transhumanist Association back in about 2002, one of our, actually, I think it was at our inaugural meeting, one of the guys that had showed up, he sat down and he said, I'm here for one reason and one reason only, and I'm scared to hell of dying. And so that was kind of an interesting, okay, I can see this was a different kind of, this is a different, again, kind of a community, if you will, that I was getting involved in and that I would be speaking to. And of course, the other gateways can be artificial intelligence, and we had a lot of AI theorists and people that were at universities studying it. That was a kind of a gateway for them as well. And of course, there were the popularizers who had actually books published. So you had Ray Kurzweil, of course, you cannot say enough about his impact. And back then it would have been the age of spiritual machines because this predated his Singularity book. There was, of course, Hans Moravec, who nobody even speaks about anymore, who's probably one of the greatest futurists who has ever lived. He's kind of disappeared into obscurity, though, I think by his own design. I do recommend reading his stuff, by the way. His robot series, all that is fantastic. And then, of course, Eric Drexler and his whole idea of molecular nanotechnology was extremely influential. So again, very niche group of people that would have found these books, would have read these books, get involved, or at least interested in extropianism and transhumanism and all that sort of thing. Okay, we can move on because I'm going to run out of time. Now, things changed, and they changed for me anyways relatively quickly. And this was the cover of Time magazine last year, so February of 2011. And it was a very profound indication to me that the landscape had been changing. To see this, I was quite taken aback, and I realized, wow, that we're no longer, as fringe as we had perhaps thought that we were, and maybe we can be a bit more daring, and maybe we can even think about expanding our audience. So that was a very this cover article obviously made an impact on me. It made me realize that this was perhaps now finally we're breaking out of the constraints that had I guess characterized us up until that point. But by the same token, if you do take a quick survey of the media landscape today, it does tend to still be toward that old school style futurism where you have the popular science and that gee whiz kind of futurism that I was talking about. But again, things are changing. You have, for example, BBC has now this feature called BBC Future, which blows me away because if you look at the top of their page, I was like news, weather, sports, future. I'm like, wow, like that's unbelievable. Like how times have changed. There's, of course, Wired magazine is as established as it gets today, both in terms of their print and what they have in digital. And even if you look at some of the more major publications like New Scientist and Technology Review, they're right up there. I would say some pretty sophisticated, I guess, reporting, if you will, or even just kind of trying to synthesize, let's say, a research or a breakthrough and perhaps extrapolate it a little bit as to its implications. And I do find that those journals are starting to catch up. And then, of course, there's what we do at IO9, and our tagline there is, we come from the future, and we have. Again, a number of things kind of inform the content of the site. We are very much there to serve the science fiction community, and there's no mistaking the sizable part of IO9 is the entertainment side of it. So I'm largely writing to an audience who is very up to speed on the science fiction. They're very they tend to be, for the most part, scientifically inclined, and they're very open to particular futuristic ideas, but as I learned, not toward necessarily all futuristic ideas. So I immediately had several challenges as I got started. And I was, I went from writing for Sentient Developments and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, thinking, okay, I can just continue to write exactly the way that I had been for Sentient Developments and everything was just going to be just fine. And within the first, you're laughing over there, for the first, I'd say 2 months, 3 months, I was pretty slaughtered in a couple of respects. One, certainly, I mean, comments mean a lot. It's a big part of what we do at IO9. It's definitely part of the gig is to engage with the community and to respond to their concerns, and again, it expands on the initial content that you had written. And so there was definitely, if I was to write, let's say, about genetic enhancement or human enhancement, those sorts of themes, or seemingly otherworldly topics that much of the audience had never been exposed to before, I would certainly hear about it in the comments section. Or even worse, would be articles that completely bombed. And of course, the big change for me with I9 as opposed to writing for anybody else is that this is a business that we're trying to run here clearly, and there needs to be engagement. There has to be readership, otherwise none of us, we're not going to be able to continue. So I had not only did I have a challenge of dealing with what was essentially Futureshock, but I also now had to start to convey concepts in a way that was going to engage an audience in a way that I didn't have to think about for my Ascension Developments audience, for example. So for example, if I titled an article along the lines of the delivery of DNA vaccine using recombinant attenuated bacterium, that wasn't going to, while it excited the hell out of me, it wasn't necessarily going to have the same kind of impact at IO9. I wasn't going to get that kind of enthusiasm or support. And what was surprised to me is that even a science fiction primed audience were still very much not on board many of these ideas. So I had to make some adjustments. So the first thing, again, this is not necessarily specific to what I do, but again, and even Annalie and I were talking about this recently, is sometimes when we step outside of our own in-group or tribe and you speak to scientists or just the everyday people, you're reminded that, oh yeah, we talk about some pretty crazy ass shit, and not everybody is either has ever heard this. They certainly are going to react to it in very different ways. So back in 1970, Alvin Toffler published the Futureshock, and back then he was referring to the psychological reactions of both individuals and society to too much change too quickly, and clearly that has great pertinence today. He meant it back then. What he was predicting was going to be a super-industrialized society. If anything, we've moved away from being a super-industrialized society, but we have a different kind of future shock that we're dealing with today. Instead, we're dealing with what are largely the potential for massively disruptive technologies, particularly as it comes to human performance and human experience, and what it actually even means to be human. And that's pretty profound. And when you start to talk about increasing IQs by a significant order of magnitude in terms of memory capacities, and certainly our expectation for lifespans, you tend to get some pretty extreme reactions as a result of it. And the kinds of reactions you get, these are things I deal with on a daily basis: incredulity, outright denial. Again, Aubrey was talking about this as well. Condemnation, so people referring to you head on as being eugenicist, or like trying to have some kind of Frankensteinian fantasy that you're trying to revive. There's even outright mockery. There's even to a certain degree even poking fun at the transhumanist community as being this kind of rapture of the nerds and so on, which I'm sure gets under the skin of a lot of people here. And then of course there's even outright anger. Like, how dare you even bring this up and so on, just for the sheer potential hubris of it, and of course the implications of it all. So today, just to kind of maybe suggest that there are versions of Futureshock that are manifesting today, and there's two examples I'd like to talk about. There is, of course, we see it in front of our eyes today, which is the whole issue behind same-sex marriage. Well, not necessarily as profound as we like to think from a transhumanist or futurist perspective. That's absolutely Futureshock, the reactions you're seeing to it. But from, let's say, a historical perspective or a sociological perspective, it's clearly what is a logical progression of the furthering of so many other rights, the extension of rights of marginalized groups and so on. So I look at it as, I guess to a certain degree, as progress. I also look at it as sociologically developmental. Others look at it as an affront to society, and thus there's that shock. So there's a prime example of future shock today. Similarly, recently what happened with Superstorm Sandy here in the United States and parts of Canada, is there has been a reluctance for some people to refer to it as a superstorm. This is the kind of thing that experts were predicting 10, 15 years ago, that we were going to enter around this time into the era of the superstorm. And that was going to be this big, it was going to be this powerful, and sure enough, it has happened. And we're now reaping what we have sown with climate change, and we have every right to refer to it as a superstorm because that's exactly what it is. But of course, at the same time, you are still going to see reaction to it. That's, no, it's just a big hurricane. No, it actually was a superstorm. So again, these are other examples of future shock here in the present. So as futurists, though, in terms of some of the things that we are instilling in terms of fear, of course, are the usual. So things like human enhancement. That's clearly the big one. So that breaking that down, cybernetics, genetics, radical life extension, the elimination of all genetic diseases. I can remember French Anderson, a geneticist, about 15 years ago predicted that all genetic diseases would be eliminated by 2020, and he is going to be probably pretty spot on. I think in another 7, 8 years, we are going to be absolutely there. Whether we choose to actually eliminate the genetic diseases still remains up to the individuals and the families, and that should be a reproductive choice. But the capacity, I think, to both prevent it and even reverse it in many cases will certainly be in place by 2020. There's also, of course, the potential for artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, even the potential for kind of an artificial consciousness, which is obviously contentious, but there you have it. And then, of course, there's issues such as animal uplift, non-human animal personhood. And these are things that threaten, of course, our primacy as the leaders or the king of the hill here as the human, as humanity. So that can include even artificial intelligence. But there's also fear that if we extend personhoods to animals and start uplifting and everything, that we suddenly won't be having that prime place here on our. How am I doing for time, by the way? Because I'm not even close to being finished. I'm okay. Okay.
No, you're up.
Okay. And of course, the other thing that will obviously instill feelings of future shock include things like the potential for autonomous machines and autonomous killing machines as well, and there is future shock exists even amongst the futurist community. And I think one of the more prevailing ideas in that respect is singularity denialism amongst transhumanists and futurists. And I think there will come a day when singularity denialism will be seen as pernicious as climate change denialism. But you heard it here.
Oh.
Dream on.
You have to wrap up.
I do have to wrap up?
Yes,
okay.
no.
Okay, that's fine. Actually, let me just... That's cool.
Okay, great.
All right.